In the last 12 months, the US government fired its top crypto regulator, banned itself from ever creating a digital dollar, signed a law that puts your bank account and your Venmo transfer under the same regulatory roof as Bitcoin, and started buying and holding crypto as an official government reserve asset, the same way it holds gold in Fort Knox. Most people scrolled right past every single headline, because on the surface it looks like a story about a niche internet currency for tech enthusiasts and speculators. But if you have a savings account, a retirement account, or you've ever sent money to family overseas, this actually touches your money directly, whether you own a single dollar of crypto or not, and whether you've ever paid attention to it before today. Over the next hour, we're going to break down exactly what changed, how the US actually got here after more than 15 years of confusion, what all of this means in plain English for your paycheck and your savings, and, just as important, what it doesn't mean, because there's a very real, very expensive difference between this got genuinely safer and this got a government press conference. Stick around, because by the end you'll know the specific number that determines whether any of this belongs anywhere near your own money, the 4 red flags that separate a real opportunity from an expensive mistake, and exactly what to actually do with this information starting today. Quick thing before we dig in. This channel exists to translate confusing financial and policy headlines into what they actually mean for your paycheck, your savings, and your future. No hype, no doom, just the numbers and the actual mechanics sitting underneath them that most coverage skips entirely. If that's useful to you, hit subscribe now, because policy like this moves fast, and most explanations online fall into one of 2 camps: paid promotion dressed up as objective news, or panic dressed up as serious analysis. This is a long, thorough breakdown, because a topic this consequential genuinely deserves more than a rushed 6-minute summary. Grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let's go through this properly, starting from the very beginning of how crypto and the US government ended up in this exact position in the first place. To understand why this year's changes are such a big deal, you need the real backstory first, not just the last 12 months of headlines. Bitcoin was created in 2009 by an anonymous developer, or possibly a group of developers, using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, published as a direct response to the 2008 financial crisis. A currency deliberately designed to work without a bank, a government, or any central authority sitting in the middle of every transaction, verifying and controlling it. For most of the 2010s, regulators mostly ignored it entirely, treating it as an internet curiosity, a hobbyist experiment far too small to meaningfully matter to the broader financial system. That changed fast once crypto's total combined value crossed into the trillions of dollars during the run-ups of 2017 and again in 2021, and by the early 2020s, the US government found itself trying to retroactively regulate an entire, sprawling financial industry that had already grown massive without anyone ever clearly telling it the actual rules it was supposed to follow from the start. Instead of writing new, clear rules for this genuinely new kind of asset, the dominant approach for years was mostly to sue first and sort out the actual rules later, in court, one company at a time. The SEC filed major lawsuits against some of the biggest names in the entire industry: Coinbase, the largest US crypto exchange; Binance, the largest global exchange; and a multi-year case against a company called Ripple that dragged on for roughly 3 full years before a judge issued a split ruling in 2023 that satisfied almost nobody involved. Company after company spent enormous amounts of money on legal defense instead of on actually building safer products or better consumer protections, because nobody could get a straight, reliable answer on which specific rules even applied to their business. Banks, worried about regulatory blowback simply for association, started quietly closing the accounts of crypto-related businesses even when those businesses had done absolutely nothing wrong and operated entirely within existing law, a pattern that later earned the nickname Choke Point 2.0, and one we'll come back to shortly, because formally ending it was one of the very first moves of this new regulatory era. Then, in November of 2022, one of the largest and most trusted crypto exchanges in the entire world, FTX, collapsed almost overnight, wiping out roughly $8 billion in customer funds that people believed were sitting safely in their own accounts. Its founder, once profiled as a boy genius billionaire on magazine covers, was later convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. FTX wasn't a hack. It wasn't simply bad luck or a bad market. It was customer money that was supposed to be held safely and separately, quietly funneled instead into risky, undisclosed bets by a related trading firm, and simply gone the moment customers tried to withdraw it during a bank run-style panic. That single collapse did more to convince ordinary Americans and skeptical lawmakers on both sides of the political aisle that crypto genuinely needed real, enforceable federal rules than an entire decade of prior warnings ever managed to accomplish combined. So here's where we actually land today, after all of that history. After years of the U.S. government treating crypto mostly as a threat to be contained through lawsuits, banking pressure, and public warnings, the approach flipped almost entirely this year into treating it instead as a legitimate industry to be built around, with real, clear federal rules replacing case-by-case lawsuits fought out in court. That shift happened through a specific, deliberate sequence of moves, each one worth understanding fully on its own, because the actual details matter far more to your money than the headline summary most people saw ever did. Let's go through each one at a time, starting with the leadership change that effectively kicked the entire sequence off. On day one of the new administration, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the agency that had spent years suing crypto companies instead of sitting down and writing clear rules for them, was formally replaced. The new chair's stated priority was almost the exact opposite of his predecessor's approach: fewer lawsuits, far more actual rulemaking, and an explicitly stated goal of giving crypto companies a genuinely clear legal path to operate inside the United States, instead of continuing to push them offshore toward countries with looser oversight, which is precisely what had been quietly happening for years as companies grew frustrated with U.S. legal uncertainty and simply relocated their operations and their jobs elsewhere. Whether you personally think that's the right call or not, the practical, measurable effect was immediate and fast. Several of the biggest pending lawsuits against major crypto companies were formally dropped or quietly settled within just a few months of the leadership change. Remember that quiet banking pressure we mentioned a moment ago? The pattern where banks closed accounts belonging to crypto businesses simply to avoid regulatory scrutiny, even when those businesses were operating completely legally and had committed no violation of any kind. That informal policy, nicknamed Operation Choke Point 2.0 by industry insiders, was formally ended this year through explicit regulatory guidance to banks. In plain terms, that means a legitimate crypto company, or an ordinary individual with legal crypto-related income, is no longer supposed to lose access to basic banking simply because a regulator quietly discouraged the bank from serving them behind closed doors. This might sound like a small, technical detail buried in a longer policy document, but it directly affected thousands of small crypto businesses, independent contractors, and freelancers who'd been abruptly cut off from ordinary checking accounts for years, sometimes with less than 2 weeks' notice and no real explanation ever provided to them. Next, an executive order formally banned the Federal Reserve from ever launching its own government-run digital currency, often referred to as a central bank digital currency, or CBDC for short. This particular move surprised a lot of casual observers, because you might reasonably assume a pro-crypto administration would want the government building and controlling its own competing digital money. The actual argument made publicly was centered on privacy and control. A government-issued CBDC would let the government directly see, and potentially even restrict, every single digital transaction an individual makes, and the order's supporters argued that private, tightly regulated stablecoins, which we're about to cover in real detail, could deliver the exact same speed and cost benefits without ever handing that level of financial visibility over to the government itself. Critics on the other side of this argument counter that this mostly just clears the field for large private companies to dominate the future of digital dollars instead of the public having any say at all. Both concerns can genuinely be true at the same time, and you'll be equipped to judge that trade-off for yourself by the time we reach the end of this video. New SEC leadership also formally launched something called Project Crypto, an ongoing, multi-year initiative to actually write clear, modern rules for exactly how crypto assets should be classified, publicly traded, and safely custodied, instead of continuing to rely on decades-old securities law that was written in the 1930s and 1940s, long before this technology existed even conceptually. This is genuinely the less flashy, far more consequential piece of the entire puzzle, even though it barely made a single headline outside of specialized financial press. Laws that grab attention get remembered and shared. Slow, unglamorous rulemaking that quietly determines whether your everyday brokerage app can legally offer you a particular crypto product next year is what actually shapes your day-to-day experience with this entire asset class going forward, even though it almost never appears on the evening news at all. If you're still with me, and this is actually starting to make real sense instead of feeling like abstract political noise, Tap that like button right now. It tells this channel to keep going genuinely deep on stories like this one, instead of just skimming headlines the way most channels do. We've now covered the who and the broad why behind everything. Next, let's get into the two actual laws that matter most for your own money, starting with the one that's already fully signed and in effect, the new federal rules around stablecoins. Before we get into the law itself, you need to genuinely understand what a stablecoin even is, because this is the single piece of all of this that touches your actual everyday wallet the most directly. A stablecoin is a crypto token deliberately designed to always be worth exactly $1. No more, no less. Unlike Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, which can swing wildly in price within a single day. The core idea is simple on paper. For every single token that exists and circulates, the company issuing it is supposed to hold one real, actual dollar, or something just as safe and immediately liquid, like short-term US government bonds, sitting in reserve at all times. That backing is what lets you send a stablecoin anywhere in the world in a matter of minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a tiny fraction of what a traditional bank wire or a money transfer service typically charges, while the person receiving it can trust it's still genuinely worth $1 the exact moment it lands in their account. Here's the part that made stablecoins genuinely risky before this specific law existed. That $1 in, one token out promise used to be based almost entirely on simple trust in a private company's word, with essentially no independent verification required by law. Some issuers, like the company behind USDC, kept relatively transparent, regularly audited reserves, and published them voluntarily. Others were far murkier and far less forthcoming about what actually backed their tokens behind the scenes. And for years, federal regulators had no clear legal requirement forcing anyone in the industry to prove it one way or the other, to anyone, on any regular schedule. You were simply trusting a private company's word that your digital dollar was genuinely, fully backed by a real one, with no actual federal law saying it had to be true, and no meaningful legal penalty if it eventually turned out not to be. And that trust gap wasn't just some abstract, theoretical risk sitting in a textbook. It had already blown up once before, spectacularly, in full public view. In May of 2022, a different kind of stablecoin called TerUSD, which wasn't actually backed by real dollars at all, but instead by a complicated algorithm paired with a sister token called Luna, completely collapsed within a matter of just a few days. Roughly $40 billion in combined value evaporated, essentially overnight, wiping out real savings for hundreds of thousands of ordinary people worldwide who'd been repeatedly told the token was stable, right up until the exact moment it very publicly, catastrophically wasn't. That single collapse is the single biggest reason lawmakers finally agreed, genuinely across party lines despite disagreeing on almost everything else, that stablecoins needed hard, enforceable, legally binding backing requirements instead of just marketing language on a company website. Which brings us directly to the actual law itself. The new law, commonly referred to by its nickname, the Genius Act, sets clear federal rules requiring every single licensed stablecoin issuer to hold one real dollar, or an equally safe and liquid asset like short-term treasury bonds, for every single token currently in circulation, with no exceptions. It also requires regular, independently verifiable disclosure of those exact reserves, so the backing can actually be checked and confirmed by outside auditors instead of simply being promised in a press release. And it establishes a clear federal licensing and ongoing oversight structure, so issuers now answer directly to real regulators instead of operating comfortably in the same murky gray zone that allowed the Terra collapse to happen in the first place, undetected until it was already too late. In plain terms, the law doesn't magically make stablecoins entirely risk-free, and it never claimed to. It makes the very specific kind of catastrophic collapse that wiped out $40 billion back in 2022 dramatically harder to pull off again without getting caught almost immediately. So why should any of this genuinely matter to you if you've personally never touched crypto in your entire life and have no plans to start? Because stablecoins are quietly becoming one of the fastest, cheapest ways to move actual money around the world, especially across international borders. A traditional cross-border money transfer can take 2 to 4 full business days to complete and can quietly eat $10, $20, sometimes $30 or more in combined fees and hidden exchange rate markup on every single transaction, without most people ever noticing exactly where that money went. A regulated, properly backed stablecoin transfer, by contrast, can settle in a matter of minutes for a small fraction of that total cost, because it skips several entire layers of intermediary banks that normally sit between two countries, each one taking its own separate cut along the way. That's not a hypothetical benefit dreamed up by some crypto company's marketing department. That's the actual, unglamorous, everyday real-world financial problem this specific law was written to make significantly safer to solve at scale. It's worth knowing who actually sits behind most of the stablecoins in circulation, since the word stablecoin can make this feel more abstract than it really is. Two companies currently dominate the vast majority of the market: Tether, issuer of the token USDT, and Circle, issuer of USDC. Combined, these two alone account for well over $150 billion in circulating stablecoins, meaning that's roughly how much real-world dollar equivalent value is already moving through this system every day, long before this year's law even passed. Circle has historically published more frequent, more detailed reserve disclosures voluntarily. Tether has historically been the larger of the two by circulating supply, but faced more skepticism over the years about the exact composition of its reserves. The new federal law applies the same baseline requirements to any issuer operating in the U.S. going forward, which is precisely the point: closing the gap between the more transparent player and the less transparent one, instead of leaving it up to each company to decide for itself how much to disclose. Here's a real, concrete pattern this law is aimed directly at solving. A woman in Texas sends $400 every single month to her mother back in the Philippines. For years, a traditional money transfer service took a flat fee plus a hidden markup buried invisibly inside the exchange rate itself, and the money routinely took 2 to 4 full days to actually land in her mother's account on the other end. Using a regulated, dollar-backed stablecoin instead, that exact same monthly transfer now settles in minutes, for a small fraction of the previous fee, because it skips the layers of intermediary banks that normally sit between two countries. Over the course of a single year, that difference quietly adds up to hundreds of real dollars that stayed in her family's pocket instead of silently disappearing into transfer fees along the way. Real, tangible money from a fairly boring, unglamorous everyday use case that has genuinely nothing to do with speculation or trading. Here's a second, less personal example that shows this exact same underlying mechanism playing out in a business setting. A small furniture importer based in Ohio used to routinely wait 3 to 5 full business days for international wire transfers to clear before an overseas supplier would agree to ship an order, tying up valuable working cash flow the entire time the payment sat in transit. After switching a meaningful portion of its supplier payments over to a regulated stablecoin payment rail, those same payments now settle same day instead, freeing up working capital that used to simply sit frozen and unusable in transit for nearly a week at a time. None of this requires the business owner to personally believe in crypto as a long-term investment or to hold a single token overnight in a speculative position. It's simply a faster, meaningfully cheaper pipe for moving ordinary dollars around the world that happens to be built on top of this underlying technology. Exactly the boring, practical use case regulators were specifically trying to make safer to build real business infrastructure on top of. If this is genuinely making a confusing, jargon-heavy topic click for you in a way it hasn't before, tap that like button. It tells this channel to keep breaking down policy changes exactly like this one, instead of just repeating vague headlines nobody actually bothers explaining properly. Now let's move into the second major piece of all this: the government's own Bitcoin reserve, because this is the part that generated by far the most attention in the press, and, honestly, also generated the most public misunderstanding along with it. Earlier this year, a separate executive order formally established something called the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, meaning the U.S. government now officially, formally holds Bitcoin as a long-term reserve asset, placed in the same conceptual category as its existing gold reserves, rather than treating it as something to be actively traded, spent, or auctioned off for quick cash whenever convenient. This was genuinely a real first for any major world government treating crypto this way at this scale, and it's the single headline out of everything we've covered so far that generated by far the most media coverage, partly because, as we're about to explain, it's also the single easiest part of this entire story to badly misunderstand. Here's the crucial detail that got lost or buried in most of the headline coverage at the time. The government did not go out and actively spend fresh taxpayer dollars buying Bitcoin on the open market to build this reserve from scratch. The initial holdings came primarily from Bitcoin the government had already legally seized over many years through federal criminal cases, fraud settlements, and civil asset forfeitures. Bitcoin the government technically already owned outright, but had historically just auctioned off for cash as quickly as administratively possible after each case closed. Instead of continuing to sell it off immediately, the new formal policy is to hold onto those existing assets as a deliberate long-term reserve going forward, rather than liquidating them the moment they're legally available. That's a meaningfully different and honestly considerably less dramatic story than the government is now actively buying up Bitcoin with your tax dollars, which is unfortunately the exaggerated version that spread fastest and widest across social media. Supporters of the new reserve like to compare it directly to the official U.S. gold reserve, physically held largely at Fort Knox since the 1930s, positioned as a long-term store of value the government simply keeps regardless of short-term price swings in either direction. It's a genuinely useful comparison for explaining the government's stated intent, but it's also an imperfect one, and it's worth being fully honest about exactly where that comparison breaks down under scrutiny. Gold has functioned reliably as a trusted store of value for literally thousands of years, across virtually every major human civilization throughout recorded history. Bitcoin, by comparison, has existed for roughly 16 years total and has already gone through 4 completely separate crashes of 50% or more in that comparatively short span of time. The comparison accurately tells you what the government's stated long-term intention actually is. Hold patiently. Don't panic sell during downturns. But it doesn't, on its own, tell you that Bitcoin has actually earned anywhere near the same multi-century track record that gold genuinely has, simply because it hasn't existed nearly long enough yet to prove that either way, decisively, in either direction. And to be genuinely fair to the skeptics here, the core criticism isn't just reflexive, knee-jerk distrust of anything crypto-related on principle. The actual argument is that a national reserve asset is generally supposed to reduce overall risk and provide real stability during a broader financial crisis, which is precisely why gold and foreign currency reserves exist as a concept in the first place, historically. An asset that can lose roughly half of its total value within a matter of months doesn't obviously serve that exact same stabilizing function, no matter how official or ceremonial the government label attached to it happens to sound in a press release. Supporters counter that this particular reserve represents only a small fraction of total government assets overall, and represents a deliberate long-term bet on Bitcoin's growing role in the future global financial system, rather than being intended as any kind of active crisis response tool. Both of these arguments genuinely hold real merit, and reasonable, well-informed people sincerely disagree here. This remains an actively unsettled debate, regardless of what any single news segment or politician confidently tells you. Alongside the Bitcoin-specific reserve, that same executive order also created a broader digital asset stockpile, covering other cryptocurrencies beyond Bitcoin that the government already holds through prior seizures, without formally committing to actively grow that particular stockpile the same deliberate way it committed to growing the Bitcoin reserve specifically. In practical terms, this mostly just formalizes existing federal crypto holdings under one single, coordinated policy umbrella, rather than continuing the old, inconsistent approach where each individual federal agency independently decided for itself whether to sell seized crypto for cash as quickly as possible. It's a genuinely smaller story than the headline-grabbing Bitcoin reserve, but it's part of that exact same broader philosophical shift. The government moving away from treating seized crypto purely as an administrative nuisance to liquidate quickly, and toward treating it instead as a real asset class worth managing deliberately and strategically over time. Before we move on, here's one detail that genuinely surprises people and that none of this new regulation touches at all. When you put money in a bank savings account, it's automatically covered by FDIC insurance up to $250,000 per depositor, meaning even if your bank collapses tomorrow, the government guarantees you get that money back. Crypto, including stablecoins and the government's own Bitcoin reserve, has no equivalent protection whatsoever, regulated or not. If a properly licensed exchange gets hacked, or a properly regulated stablecoin issuer somehow still fails despite the new backing rules, there is no government insurance fund standing behind your individual holdings the way there is for a checking account. New rules dramatically lower the odds of that kind of failure happening in the first place. They do not add a safety net underneath you if it happens anyway, and that's a meaningful, permanent difference between crypto and the money already sitting in your bank account today. Drop a comment right now and tell me honestly, does a government formally holding Bitcoin as an official reserve asset genuinely make sense to you personally? Or does the whole idea sound like a stretch dressed up in official language? I genuinely read every single comment, and it directly shapes which of these policy threads we decide to pull on next in future videos. Now let's move on and cover the piece of this entire story that's still genuinely unfinished, because the claim crypto is now fully regulated is only about half true until this next specific law actually passes through Congress. There's a second, separate bill still actively moving through Congress right now, often referred to as the Clarity Act, that would finally answer the single specific question that's confused crypto investors, companies, and regulators alike for well over a decade now. Is a given crypto token legally a security, regulated strictly like a stock with heavy disclosure requirements? Or is it a commodity, regulated far more loosely, closer to how oil or wheat gets regulated? This isn't merely a dry technical distinction that lawyers argue about purely for academic fun. It directly determines which specific regulator holds legal authority, what disclosures a company is legally required to make to the public, and whether a given token can even legally be offered to everyday retail investors like you in the first place at all. Remember the Ripple lawsuit we mentioned briefly earlier in this video? That grueling 3-year legal battle happened almost entirely because there was no clear existing law answering this exact classification question, so it had to get fought out expensively, case by case, in federal court, with an outcome that ultimately only applied narrowly to that one specific company's particular situation. In 2023, a federal judge ruled that Ripple's token wasn't automatically a security when sold to the general public on an open exchange, but could still legally be treated as one when sold directly to large institutional investors instead, a genuinely split, complicated ruling that satisfied almost nobody involved on either side, and left the exact same broader classification question just as unresolved for every other crypto company watching anxiously from the sidelines. That's precisely the ongoing legal mess the Clarity Act is specifically trying to permanently settle once and for all with an actual, comprehensive law, instead of leaving it to get endlessly relitigated company by company, judge by judge, for another entire decade to come. As of right now, the Clarity Act has genuine bipartisan support in Congress and has already passed one full chamber, with a final vote in the other chamber currently expected sometime around mid-September. It has not, however, been officially signed into law yet, and until it is, its actual provisions remain proposals, not enforceable rules. This particular distinction matters enormously, because a meaningful chunk of the recent broader market excitement and enthusiasm around crypto is quietly already pricing in a law that technically doesn't fully exist yet in its final form. If it ultimately passes largely as currently written, expect a real wave of more mainstream financial products, additional ETFs, more retirement plan options, deeper brokerage integrations, to launch considerably faster because companies will finally have a genuinely clear legal green light instead of continuing to operate cautiously inside a gray zone. If it instead stalls, gets significantly delayed, or gets meaningfully watered down in negotiations, a real chunk of that anticipated market momentum could very plausibly stall right alongside it. Since this broader regulatory shift first began, the total number of companies going public on U.S. stock exchanges has jumped roughly 75% compared to the previous administration's final year and a half in office, collectively raising close to $28 billion in the process, nearly 4 times the previous pace of new public offerings. That surge isn't exclusively crypto-related, to be fair, but a genuinely real chunk of that overall jump is directly tied to crypto and fintech companies that had been sitting cautiously on the sidelines for years, unwilling to go public into unclear and hostile regulatory territory, and are now finally moving forward with confidence. Regulators also formally approved the first federally registered Bitcoin perpetual futures contract of its specific kind, a fully regulated financial product that lets large institutional investors bet on Bitcoin's future price movement without ever having to hold the actual underlying asset directly. A product type that simply didn't have any legal clearance to exist in this particular regulated form before this year. There's a quieter, arguably more important trend running underneath all of this that genuinely deserves its own dedicated explanation. Tokenization. Essentially, the process of taking traditional financial assets, like company stock, commercial real estate, or investment fund shares, and representing legal ownership of them digitally on the exact same kind of blockchain technology that crypto itself runs on. Several major brokerages are now actively expanding tokenized versions of stocks and other real-world assets into more than 100 additional countries around the world, letting ordinary people in markets with historically weaker banking infrastructure by fractional ownership of, say, a well-known U.S. stock, settle that purchase near instantly and trade it around the clock, 7 days a week, instead of being limited to only trading during regular market hours in a single time zone. This is genuinely one of the more useful, practical long-term applications to emerge from this entire regulatory shift, even though it consistently gets far less media attention than Bitcoin's day-to-day price movements do. We've used the word blockchain several times now without really explaining it. So let's fix that quickly, because it makes everything else easier to understand. A blockchain is essentially a shared digital ledger, copied across thousands of independent computers around the world at once, that records every single transaction permanently and in order, with no single company or government controlling the master copy. Instead of one bank's private database deciding whether your transaction is valid, thousands of independent computers each check the math themselves and have to agree before it's added to the permanent record. That's the actual innovation underneath all of this. Not really the coins themselves, but a new way to keep a trustworthy, tamper-resistant record of who owns what. Without needing one central authority, everyone has to blindly trust. Stablecoins, Bitcoin, and tokenized stocks all sit on top of some version of this same basic idea. It's also worth addressing the environmental criticism honestly, because it's real and it predates all of this year's news. Bitcoin specifically is secured through a process called mining, where computers around the world compete to solve complex math problems, and that competition consumes a genuinely large amount of electricity, by some estimates, comparable to the annual electricity use of a mid-sized country. Supporters point out that a growing share of that mining now runs on stranded or otherwise wasted energy, like excess natural gas or surplus hydropower that would go unused anyway. Critics counter that the total consumption is still enormous regardless of the source, and growing as the network gets larger. Neither point cancels the other out, and none of this year's regulatory changes affect this specific debate one way or the other. It's a separate, ongoing conversation worth knowing about if you're weighing Bitcoin against other options. If you've genuinely made it this far into the video, seriously, tap that like button right now. This is exactly the kind of thorough, deep dive content that YouTube's algorithm tends to quietly bury unless real viewers actively signal they actually want more of it. We've now thoroughly covered what changed and precisely why it changed. Next, let's get into the part that probably matters most directly to you personally: your own retirement account, your taxes, and the real, honest risks that almost nobody covering this story on the news actually says out loud. With clear federal rules finally forming around this entire asset class, more and more retirement plan providers are cautiously starting to offer limited crypto exposure directly inside standard 401k plan menus, something that was legally murky, genuinely risky from a liability standpoint, and mostly avoided entirely by providers just a couple of years ago. If you happen to see a crypto option newly appear inside your own plan's menu, understand clearly what it actually is in practice. Usually a small, deliberately capped allocation option sitting alongside your normal stock and bond funds, not any kind of replacement for them, and typically wrapped safely inside a regulated fund structure rather than direct personal ownership of the underlying coins themselves. A few years ago, the U.S. Department of Labor actively discouraged 401k plan administrators from offering any crypto exposure at all, formally warning that doing so could expose them to serious legal liability for knowingly exposing ordinary workers' retirement savings to an unproven, highly volatile asset class without sufficient justification. That specific guidance was quietly rolled back earlier this year, and this is actually the unglamorous, behind-the-scenes regulatory change genuinely driving the recent wave of retirement plans cautiously adding crypto options, far more so than any single flashy headline about Bitcoin's price ever could. It doesn't mean crypto inside your 401k is now being actively recommended by regulators. It simply means plan administrators are no longer specifically, legally discouraged from offering it as an option, which is a meaningfully different and considerably lower bar to clear. Some retirement providers are now quietly adding a small crypto slice, often somewhere between just 1 and 5% of total holdings, directly inside target date retirement funds. The popular set it and forget it default investment option millions of Americans get automatically enrolled into by their employer without ever actively, deliberately choosing it themselves. If that description matches your own retirement account, it's genuinely worth actually checking your specific fund's underlying holdings at least once a year going forward, because you can end up carrying meaningful crypto exposure without ever consciously making an active decision to add it yourself, simply because it got quietly bundled by default into whatever target date fund your employer happened to select on your behalf. Here's a detail that genuinely surprises a lot of people when they first hear it. None of this sweeping regulatory change actually changes the basic underlying tax treatment of crypto at all. The IRS still officially treats crypto as property, not as currency, meaning every single time you sell, trade, or even spend crypto at a profit, that specific transaction counts as a fully taxable event you're legally required to report, exactly the same way selling appreciated stock would be. What has genuinely changed is the surrounding reporting infrastructure. Crypto exchanges are now legally required to issue considerably clearer tax forms, quite similar to what traditional brokerages already send investors for ordinary stock trades, which makes it dramatically harder to simply forget to report crypto gains the way many people casually used to, whether that was done on purpose or genuinely by accident. More legitimacy has arrived hand in hand with more paperwork, not less. That specific trade-off is entirely real, and it's genuinely worth knowing about clearly before it catches you off guard at tax time next spring. Here's another real, concrete pattern worth knowing about before you make any decision involving your own retirement account. A 52-year-old public school teacher noticed a brand new crypto option had appeared inside her 403(b) retirement plan, and after seeing all the recent news coverage, seriously considered moving a meaningful chunk of her total retirement savings into it, mistakenly assuming the new government backing meant the asset had basically become safe by default. Instead, she spent one single afternoon actually reading through the fund's own official disclosure documents in detail, discovered it deliberately capped total crypto exposure at just 3% of a broader balanced fund by careful design, and decided that smaller amount was a genuinely reasonable exposure to hold given she had 13 years remaining until her planned retirement date, not the 40 or 50% she'd originally been seriously considering after getting caught up emotionally in the surrounding headlines. Same publicly available information everyone else saw that week. The only real difference was 10 extra minutes spent actually reading the fine print carefully before deciding anything. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, would you personally actually want a crypto option available inside your own retirement plan, even a small, tightly capped one, or would you genuinely rather it simply not exist as an option at all for you? I read every single comment on these videos, and honestly, the real split of opinion on this particular question tends to be much closer than most people would probably guess going in. Now let's talk honestly and directly about the real risks involved here, because this next part is exactly what almost nobody covering this story in the mainstream news actually says out loud. Here's the honest, uncomfortable part that almost nobody covering this story says clearly enough. New federal rules genuinely make the underlying financial plumbing safer. How stablecoins get backed, how exchanges get registered, how fraud eventually gets prosecuted after the fact once it's discovered. New rules do not, however, make a fundamentally volatile asset any less volatile day to day. A federal government formally holding Bitcoin, or a brand new law properly regulating stablecoins, does not somehow repeal basic supply and demand economics, or the underlying fact that crypto prices are still driven heavily by shifting sentiment, pure speculation, and short-term momentum trading, layered directly on top of whatever real underlying fundamentals genuinely exist beneath the surface. Look closely at the actual historical numbers here, not just the surrounding narrative. Bitcoin has dropped more than 50% from its all-time peak at least 4 completely separate times over roughly the last decade alone. Sharply in 2018, sharply again in 2022, and in several shorter, sharper pullbacks scattered in between those two larger crashes. Each and every time, headlines published right at the peak confidently called the growth inevitable, permanent, and essentially unstoppable going forward. Each and every time, a clear majority of those recent gains got wiped out again within a matter of months, before eventually recovering, in most, but importantly not all individual cases, over a considerably longer time frame than most holders initially expected. Government backing, in absolutely any form, has never once in history prevented an asset from experiencing a genuine, painful price crash. Just ask anyone who held government bonds from countries that later defaulted on them, or ask anyone holding gold itself during the specific historical years it also fell sharply in value. Legitimacy and volatility are two completely separate, unrelated qualities, and quietly conflating the two together is exactly how ordinary people end up turning an exciting policy headline into a genuinely bad, regrettable financial decision. It's genuinely worth explicitly remembering FTX again here too, because it carries an important, uncomfortable lesson that applies directly to today's situation. FTX wasn't some sketchy, unregulated back-alley operation run out of someone's garage. It was one of the most prominent, well-connected, and seemingly credible companies in the entire industry at the time, complete with famous celebrity endorsements, prestigious venture capital investors, and a young founder who personally testified in front of Congress as a supposed industry expert less than a full year before the entire company collapsed overnight. New rules and newfound mainstream legitimacy genuinely raise the average quality bar across the entire industry over time. They do not, and fundamentally cannot, guarantee that any single specific company, coin, or exchange you personally choose to trust is actually trustworthy underneath the surface. That ongoing verification remains entirely your own personal responsibility, no matter how official or reassuring the surrounding policy environment happens to sound in any given month. None of these sweeping new laws do anything at all to stop fraudulent, worthless tokens from being created and aggressively marketed every single day. A new federal stablecoin law regulates actual, licensed stablecoins specifically, not the many thousands of completely unrelated tokens launched every single week with absolutely no real backing, no functioning product behind them, and honestly no genuine intention of lasting more than a few weeks or months before quietly disappearing. A classic rug pull scheme, where developers aggressively hype up a new token online, successfully collect real money from eager buyers, then simply vanish completely with all the funds, remains exactly as possible today as it was 5 full years ago, and increased mainstream media attention on crypto in general actually tends to attract meaningfully more of these predatory scams over time, not fewer, simply because there are now far more new, inexperienced buyers actively entering the market for opportunistic scammers to specifically target. The single most common way ordinary, everyday people actually lose real crypto money isn't some dramatic, sophisticated hack of a major exchange you'd read about in the news. It's phishing, a convincing fake email, text message, or entire cloned website carefully designed to look exactly like a legitimate exchange or wallet provider, deliberately tricking you into typing your actual private login credentials or your wallet's secret recovery phrase into the wrong place. No new law changes this particular risk even slightly, because it's fundamentally not a regulatory problem at all. It's a basic personal security hygiene problem, functionally no different from the exact same kinds of scams that have long targeted ordinary online banking customers. Anyone who contacts you first, unprompted, asking for your recovery phrase, your private keys, or any form of remote access to your personal device is actively attempting to steal directly from you. Full stop, regardless of how official, urgent, or convincingly professional the surrounding message happens to sound. Since we're on the topic of scams, one practical note in case it ever happens to you or someone you know. If you lose money to a crypto scam, report it immediately to the FTC at reportfraud.ftc.gov and to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center at ic3.gov, even if you assume nothing will come of it. These reports rarely get you your specific money back, but they feed directly into ongoing law enforcement investigations that do eventually shut down repeat offenders, and the faster a scam gets reported, the better the odds of freezing funds before they move again. Acting within the first hour, contacting your exchange's support line immediately and asking whether the destination address has already been flagged elsewhere gives you the best realistic odds of any of this actually working, though realistically, prevention through the security habits we already covered remains far more reliable than any recovery attempt after the fact. Here's yet another real, concrete pattern worth genuinely knowing about before you make any significant decision involving your own hard-earned money. A 34-year-old software developer heard about the new government Bitcoin reserve news and impulsively moved 60% of his total retirement savings into crypto within a single week, mistakenly assuming the new government backing basically meant guaranteed, steady growth going forward from that point on. 8 months later, a fairly routine, ordinary market pullback cut that specific portion of his savings by nearly a third in value, and he was ultimately forced to sell at a real loss just to cover an unrelated, unexpected emergency car repair bill, permanently locking in an actual financial loss that a more balanced, diversified allocation strategy would have easily absorbed without ever forcing a single stressful decision under financial pressure. The genuine lesson here isn't avoid crypto entirely, forever. It's that newfound legitimacy is simply not the same thing as low risk, and mistakenly treating the two as identical is exactly how an exciting policy headline quietly turns into a real, painful, and completely avoidable financial setback. Zooming out from the US for just a moment, it's genuinely worth knowing that America isn't operating in complete isolation on this particular issue globally. The European Union rolled out its own comprehensive crypto regulatory framework, called MiCA, back in 2024, taking a broadly similar overall approach. Clear mandatory licensing, required reserve backing specifically for stablecoins, and standardized consumer protection rules across all member countries. El Salvador went in the completely opposite direction back in 2021, making Bitcoin official legal tender outright nationwide. A genuinely radical, still actively debated economic experiment happening in a much smaller national economy. China, meanwhile, took by far the harshest stance of any major global economy, banning crypto trading and mining entirely back in 2021, citing serious financial stability risks and capital control concerns as its official reasoning. The overall global picture here is genuinely mixed and inconsistent, and it clearly tells you this isn't some settled, obvious topic with one correct answer anywhere in the world. Reasonable governments and reasonable, well-informed people within them are still landing in very different places on exactly how much to embrace this technology. It's also genuinely worth being fully straightforward about the political criticism surrounding all of this, because pretending it simply doesn't exist wouldn't be honest, complete coverage of the actual topic. Critics specifically point to the crypto industry's dramatically increased campaign contributions and lobbying spending across recent election cycles, and argue that some of these particular policy changes disproportionately benefit specific companies and individuals with direct personal financial ties to the current administration, far more than they meaningfully benefit the average American simply trying to send an affordable remittance payment home to family. Supporters of the changes counter that clear, comprehensive regulation genuinely benefits the entire industry broadly, not merely a few well-connected insiders, and argue that the previous approach of regulation by lawsuit was arguably far worse for genuine competition overall, since only the largest, best-funded companies could realistically afford years of expensive legal battles to survive it. You don't necessarily have to fully resolve that ongoing political debate yourself to understand the actual technical mechanics of what changed here, but you absolutely should know that debate genuinely exists before uncritically accepting any single source's framing at complete face value. If any of this feels like a familiar pattern, it's because it is. Back in the late 1990s, the internet itself was the this changes everything technology, and it genuinely did change everything, eventually. But the dot-com stock bubble that rode along with it still wiped out roughly 80% of the Nasdaq's value between 2000 and 2002, taking down thousands of companies that had real websites and real users, but no real path to actual profit. The internet's long-term impact and the dot-com bubble's short-term crash were both true at the same time. Being right about the technology's future didn't protect anyone from being wrong about the timing, or wrong about which specific companies would actually survive to see it. Crypto's regulatory legitimacy this year tells you something real about its long-term direction. It tells you nothing about which specific tokens or what specific timeline will actually pan out, and history says a real number of today's excitement will not survive the next decade intact. One more important distinction worth making clearly before we move into the practical framework. Not all crypto is remotely the same kind of asset, even though headlines constantly lump everything together under one single word. Bitcoin, specifically, has the longest track record, the deepest liquidity, and now the clearest, most direct government recognition of anything in the entire space. Beyond Bitcoin, there are thousands of other tokens, often loosely called altcoins, ranging from genuinely useful blockchain platforms with real ongoing development teams and real functioning products, all the way down to pure memecoins that openly admit they have no underlying utility whatsoever and exist purely as speculation and internet humor. Government reserve status, and the new regulatory clarity we've covered throughout this entire video, currently applies specifically to Bitcoin and to properly regulated stablecoins. It does not automatically apply to or endorse every single one of the thousands of other tokens that happen to share the broad word crypto in casual conversation, and treating them all as equally legitimate simply because of this news is a genuinely common, costly mistake. Two smaller, practical trends worth knowing about before we wrap up. First, a small but growing number of employers, especially companies with international remote teams, now offer the option to receive part of your paycheck in a regulated stablecoin instead of a traditional bank deposit. Genuinely useful for workers getting paid from abroad who'd otherwise lose a chunk of every paycheck to international transfer fees, but worth remembering it's still an opt-in choice, not a replacement for direct deposit, at virtually every company offering it. Second, several major credit card issuers now offer crypto-backed rewards cards, similar to cashback cards, except your rewards accumulate in Bitcoin instead of dollars. That can be a fun, low-stakes way to gain small exposure, but treat the rewards balance with the same caution as any other crypto holding. It's genuinely subject to the exact same volatility as money you bought directly. Here's one more real, concrete pattern worth knowing. A freelance graphic designer in Colorado works primarily with clients based in Europe and Australia, and for years, international wire fees and multi-day delays regularly ate 8 to 12% of each invoice by the time the money actually cleared and landed in her account. Switching invoicing to a regulated, dollar-backed stablecoin cut that cost down to roughly 1%, with funds landing same day instead of a week later. She still converts everything straight to her regular bank account immediately upon receiving it. She's not holding crypto as an investment and has no interest in doing so. It's purely a cheaper, faster pipe for money she was always going to spend anyway, which is exactly the boring, practical benefit this year's changes were actually designed to unlock at scale. Let's clear up 3 specific myths that tend to spread fast every time a story like this makes headlines. Myth 1. The government now backs Bitcoin's price, which isn't accurate. The government holds Bitcoin as a reserve asset, the same way it holds gold, without ever promising to prop up or guarantee its market price. Myth 2. Stablecoins are now completely risk-free, which also isn't accurate. The new law dramatically reduces the specific risk that caused the 2022 Terra collapse, but doesn't eliminate every possible risk, including the issuer itself mismanaging operations or a properly backed coin still losing its peg briefly during extreme market stress. And Myth 3. Crypto is now the same as a bank account, which definitively isn't accurate, mainly because of the FDIC insurance gap we covered earlier. Getting these 3 details right is the difference between making an informed decision and repeating a headline you half remember from a 15-second video somewhere else. If, after everything we've covered, you decide you genuinely do want some exposure, here's the boring, responsible way to actually do it, step by step. Choose a large, well-known, US-regulated exchange, not a random app you found through a social media ad, and complete its identity verification process fully, since that verification is exactly the kind of consumer protection this year's regulatory shift was meant to strengthen. Start with a small amount you've already decided in advance you're fully prepared to lose. Turn on 2-factor authentication using an authenticator app, not just a text message, since phone numbers can be hijacked. Never store your recovery phrase in a photo, an email, or a cloud note. Write it on paper and keep it somewhere private. And resist the urge to check the price daily. The entire point of the framework we covered is a long-term, small, deliberate allocation, not a new hobby that costs you sleep. If this has genuinely helped untangle a topic that's usually explained to you as either pure uncritical hype or pure uninformed panic, tap that like button one more time right now. It's honestly the single biggest signal that tells this channel to keep making thorough, deep dive videos exactly like this one, instead of the same rushed, surface-level 6-minute version basically every other channel puts out on the exact same topic. We're genuinely in the home stretch now. Let's turn everything we've carefully covered so far into one actual, practical framework you can immediately use in your own life. Rule 1. Clearly separate the payment story from the investing story in your own head, because the news constantly, carelessly blurs these 2 completely different things into one, even though they carry genuinely different levels of underlying risk. Using regulated stablecoins simply for sending money cheaply and quickly is a fundamentally lower risk topic than actively speculating on Bitcoin's future price movements, even though both technically fall under that same broad, catch-all word crypto in almost every single headline you'll ever read. You can genuinely benefit from just the payment side of this entire shift, like the remittance example we walked through earlier, without ever needing to personally own a single dollar of any volatile speculative asset at all. And those really are 2 completely separate decisions that deserve 2 completely separate, appropriately calibrated levels of personal caution. Rule 2. The government now formally holds some of it, is simply not a price target, and it genuinely never has been for any asset in history, including gold itself, which the government has held continuously for many decades straight through absolutely massive price swings in both directions, without that ongoing government ownership ever once preventing a single one of those swings from happening. If you do personally want any investment exposure to this space at all, the exact same boring, unglamorous rule that has always applied to stocks applies equally well here. Only ever use money you could genuinely, fully afford to lose completely without it meaningfully changing your life or your family's stability. Spread your actual buying out gradually over time instead of committing it all at once in a single moment. And treat any single asset, crypto or otherwise, as just one small piece of a much broader financial plan rather than mistaking it for the entire plan itself. To put the risk in real perspective, compare Bitcoin's volatility to what you're probably already holding. The S&P 500, a broad basket of the 500 largest US companies, has had genuinely bad years too. It fell about 37% in 2008 during the financial crisis, and about 19% in 2022. But a 50% plus drop, the kind Bitcoin has experienced 4 separate times in a decade, has never happened to the S&P 500 in its entire history, even during the Great Depression's worst single year. That's not a reason to avoid crypto entirely, but it is a reason to size any position honestly. An asset with meaningfully higher highs and meaningfully lower lows deserves a meaningfully smaller slice of your overall portfolio than your core retirement holdings, not an equal one, no matter how exciting this year's news cycle has made it feel. Rule 3. Genuinely understand the practical difference between holding crypto on a regulated exchange versus holding it yourself directly in what's technically called a self-custody wallet. Keeping it on an exchange is far more convenient and now considerably more regulated than ever before, but it fundamentally means you're trusting that specific companies' own internal security practices, quite similar to how you already trust a traditional bank. Self-custody, often managed through a small dedicated hardware device, means you personally directly control the private keys yourself, with no outside company ever able to freeze or lose your funds on your behalf. But it also means there's genuinely no customer service line to call if you personally make a mistake or accidentally lose access yourself. Neither specific option is universally the correct one for everybody. The real mistake most people make is simply not clearly knowing which one they're actually using at any given time, and therefore not properly understanding which specific risks they're personally exposed to as a direct result. And Rule 4, the final practical checklist to actually use going forward. Treat any single one of these 4 specific warning signs as an immediate, non-negotiable red flag, with genuinely no exceptions ever. Guaranteed returns of any specific kind whatsoever. Absolutely nothing legitimate in this particular space, or honestly in any investing space at all, can ever honestly guarantee a specific fixed return to you. Any pressure to act immediately or supposedly miss out forever. Genuinely legitimate opportunities simply do not evaporate completely within the next 10 minutes of your life. Any request for your private keys, your recovery phrase, or remote access to your personal device coming from anyone who contacted you first without being asked. And finally, anyone specifically using this exact news story, these new laws, the new government reserve, as their specific stated reason you supposedly need to buy something from them right now, today, immediately. Real, meaningful regulatory change genuinely unfolds gradually over many months and years. Artificial urgency dressed up convincingly as a rare opportunity is almost always secretly the exact opposite of one. So what should you actually keep an eye on going forward? Instead of just reacting to the next isolated headline, watch the Clarity Act vote around mid-September. Its outcome will do more to shape the next few years of this industry than anything we've covered so far, since it determines the basic legal ground rules for everything beyond payments. Watch whether major retirement providers expand crypto options meaningfully or quietly keep them capped and marginal, since that tells you how confident the actual financial industry is, separate from political rhetoric. And watch whether Bitcoin's volatility genuinely moderates over the next few years as more regulated, institutional money flows in, or whether it keeps behaving the way it always has despite the new legitimacy. That single answer will tell you more about whether the gold comparison holds up than any government press release ever will. One last practical question worth answering directly. Does any of this affect the actual US dollar sitting in your own checking account right now, or inflation more broadly? Indirectly, yes, in a way worth understanding. Since regulated stablecoins are required to hold their reserves largely in short-term US Treasury bonds, rapid growth in the stablecoin market actually creates new, steady demand for US government debt, which is one of the specific reasons some lawmakers who aren't personally interested in crypto at all still voted for this law, purely for its effect on Treasury demand. It doesn't directly change the inflation rate you see at the grocery store, which is driven by a much broader set of factors. But it does mean stablecoins are becoming a quiet, growing piece of how the US government finances its own debt going forward, which is exactly the kind of underlying detail that explains why this law had genuine bipartisan support in Congress, well beyond anyone who personally cares about crypto as a technology. So, in plain, simple English, here's a complete recap of everything that has actually happened this year. The government replaced its top crypto regulator and formally, permanently ended the quiet banking pressure that had been unfairly cutting off legitimate crypto businesses from basic banking access for years. It banned itself outright from ever creating its own government-run digital dollar. It signed real, enforceable federal rules requiring stablecoins to actually be backed one-to-one by real dollars or equally safe assets, independently verifiable and legally enforceable. Genuinely the single part of all this most likely to directly help you personally if you ever send money internationally to family or friends. It started formally holding already seized Bitcoin as a deliberate long-term reserve asset, placed in that same broad category as gold, funded entirely by existing legal seizures rather than any new taxpayer spending. Retirement plans are now cautiously beginning to offer small, tightly capped crypto exposure options, now that outdated official warnings against doing so have finally been formally lifted. And the specific law that would finally clarify once and for all whether tokens count as securities or commodities is still sitting and signed in Congress right now, with a vote currently expected around mid-September. These are real, substantive changes, with real, tangible implications for your own wallet, but they are not, on their own, any kind of reason to overhaul your entire financial plan overnight. And they are definitely not any kind of guarantee against the very real, well-documented volatility this specific asset class has consistently shown, repeatedly, throughout its entire 16-year history so far. Every few years, some new piece of financial news gets loud enough and spreads fast enough that it genuinely feels like you absolutely have to react to it immediately or get permanently left behind forever. Almost every single time, without exception, the people who actually come out ahead years later aren't the ones who reacted the very fastest in the moment. They're consistently the ones who took the time to actually understand what genuinely changed and what didn't, before they ever moved a single dollar of their own hard-earned money. You don't personally need to accurately predict exactly where crypto goes next in order to make a genuinely good decision here today, right now. You simply need to clearly know the real, honest difference between what actually got safer, what fundamentally didn't change at all beneath the surface, and what's still, right now, nothing more than a headline patiently waiting to eventually become an actual, signed law. That's the entire game, honestly, in every single significant financial decision you'll ever make in your life, not just this particular one. Subscribe for the next deep dive breakdown like this one, and I'll genuinely see you in the very next video.